Before dawn on February the 1st, 1944, the men inside the bunkers on Kwajalein Atoll could feel the island trembling beneath them. Coral dust drifted from the ceilings. Sand fell into rifle bolts and onto sweating hands. The air smelled of salt, oil, and fear. Outside, the lagoon looked calm in the darkness, but beyond the reef, an entire American fleet was waiting. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transports, and landing craft covered the horizon. More than 40,000 American sailors and soldiers had come for one narrow strip of coral that many Japanese officers believed could never be taken quickly. Within 4 days, nearly the entire garrison would be dead. Around 7,870 Japanese defenders would be killed.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
Kwajalein would become one of the most devastating and one-sided battles in the Central Pacific. To understand why so many men died in so little time, you have to step inside the bunkers with them. Kwajalein Island was long and thin, stretching roughly 5 miles from end to end, and in some places only a few hundred yards wide. It sat in the center of the Marshall Islands, a major defensive line in Japan's outer Pacific Empire. Since 1919, the islands had been under Japanese control. For years, military engineers had transformed them into fortified bases. Airfields, ammunition dumps, concrete strongpoints, machine gun nests, anti-boat obstacles, and buried command posts were built across the coral. The senior officer on the island was Colonel Mons Akiyama. A veteran infantry commander, Akiyama had around 8,100 personnel under his authority, including Army troops, naval landing forces, laborers, and support units. On paper, the number seemed impressive. In reality, many were not trained frontline infantry. Some were construction workers and mechanics, others had limited combat preparation. But Japanese doctrine was clear. There would be no surrender. Every man was expected to fight to the death. For months, the garrison prepared. Trenches were dug, palm logs were buried under sand, coral bunkers were reinforced, ammunition was distributed, heavy and light machine guns were positioned to sweep likely landing beaches. Mortars were sighted, officers studied maps and estimated where the Americans would come ashore. Many defenders believed the greatest danger would come from the sea. They expected landing craft to be torn apart before reaching the shore. They believed artillery and machine gun fire would cut down the attackers on the beaches. They had studied earlier Pacific battles where American troops had paid heavily to seize fortified islands. But the Americans had also studied those battles, and they had learned. The assault on Kwajalein was part of Operation Flintlock, commanded by Admiral Chester W. Nimitz under the Central Pacific Drive. Operational control at sea was led by Admiral Raymond A. Spruance. Amphibious forces were directed by Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner. On the ground, Major General Charles H. Corlett commanded the 7th Infantry Division, the unit assigned to capture Kwajalein Island itself. American planners did something that changed the battle before it began. Instead of landing directly against the strongest defenses without rehearsal, they first seized nearby small islands in the lagoon. These positions provided artillery sites and observation points. From there, U.S. guns could fire accurately into Japanese positions at close range. Then came the bombardment. For days, naval guns pounded the atoll. Battleships fired 14-inch and 16-inch shells. Cruisers added 8-inch rounds. Destroyers moved in close, blasting bunkers with rapid fire. Carrier aircraft dropped bombs and strafed anything that moved. Thousands of shells struck the narrow island. Inside the bunkers, time lost meaning. Each explosion sent a violent shock through the coral. Men pressed themselves against walls and covered their ears. Electric lines snapped. Radios failed. Ammunition boxes shifted. Water containers split open. The noise was constant. There was no quiet, no safe corner, no sleep. Some defenders tried to reassure each other that the bunkers would hold. Many did. Thick layers of sand and coral absorbed astonishing punishment. But survival came with a cost. Entrances were buried. Ventilation was reduced. Heat rose. Dust filled lungs. Wounded men bled in darkness with little medical care. When soldiers crawled outside to inspect damage, they often found landmarks gone. Palm trees had been shredded. Gun positions had disappeared. Telephone wires lay in tangled heaps. Entire sections of trench were flattened. On January 31, American troops captured small islands surrounding the main objective. Field artillery was brought in quickly. Soon, 105 howitzers were firing directly across the lagoon. Japanese positions that had already endured naval and air bombardment now faced accurate artillery from short range. Colonel Akiyama understood what this meant. The Americans were methodically reducing the island before the main landing. The defenders were being isolated and weakened hour by hour. Before sunrise on February 1, the shelling intensified. Battleships moved into position. Aircraft attacked again. Destroyers closed to short range. The bombardment was so heavy that some American observers later described the island as if it had been run through a giant grinder. Smoke and dust rose in thick columns. Fires burned among shattered buildings. Then, through the haze, the first amphibious tractors appeared. These tracked vehicles, known as LVTs, moved steadily across the reef and through shallow water that might have stopped ordinary landing craft. Packed with soldiers of the 7th Infantry Division, they advanced toward the beaches with artillery and naval fire still exploding ahead of them. Inside the surviving bunkers, Japanese soldiers gripped rifles and machine gun triggers. They waited for the shelling to lift. They waited for the chance to fire. But when they emerged, many discovered their weapons were buried, damaged, or pointed at terrain that no longer existed. At approximately 0930, American troops hit the beaches on the western end of Kwajalein Island. Resistance was immediate but scattered. Some machine guns opened fire. Mortars dropped rounds among the landing waves. Snipers shot from craters and rubble. Yet the expected wall of coordinated defense never fully materialized. Years of preparation had been broken apart by concentrated bombardment. American infantry moved inland with practiced speed. Tanks followed. Combat engineers blasted obstacles and cleared strongpoints with explosives and flamethrowers. Artillery observers called in supporting fire only yards ahead of advancing troops. For Japanese defenders, the battle became intensely local. One bunker might still have a functioning machine gun and enough ammunition to hold for hours. Another nearby position might already be sealed under tons of coral. Some groups had officers and radios, others were completely cut off and had no idea what was happening elsewhere on the island. In the darkness of one buried shelter, a wounded corporal listened as footsteps approached overhead. Dust drifted from the ceiling. Then came a metallic sound at the entrance. An explosive charge detonated. Light and smoke rushed in. Survivors who staggered outside were met by rifle fire. This pattern repeated again and again. American troops did not simply run past strongpoints. They isolated them, called up engineers, and destroyed them systematically. Satchel charges collapsed entrances. Flamethrowers sent burning fuel through firing slits. Tank guns blasted log and coral walls at close range. The narrow shape of the island made defense even harder. There was little depth. Once the Americans established a foothold, they could push across the width of the island in minutes, cutting positions off from one another. By the afternoon of February the 1st, U.S. forces had advanced significantly eastward. Japanese resistance remained fierce in pockets, but coordination was deteriorating rapidly. Colonel Akiyama moved between positions when possible, attempting to restore order. He urged officers to continue fighting and organize local counterattacks. Yet communications were unreliable, and many units had already ceased to exist as organized formations. Night brought no relief. As darkness fell, surviving Japanese soldiers prepared for infiltration attacks and desperate charges. They knew daylight favored the Americans, whose artillery and naval guns could strike with devastating precision. At night, there was still a chance to close the distance. Small groups moved through wrecked trenches and shell holes. Some reached American lines and attacked with rifles, grenades, and bayonets. Fighting erupted at close range. Flares lit the shattered island in brief white flashes. Shadows ran between craters. Machine guns fired at movement and sound. The attacks were courageous, but they could not reverse the situation. American defensive positions were supported by automatic weapons, mortars, and pre-registered artillery. Most Japanese assault groups were destroyed before they could cause significant disruption. At dawn on February 2nd, the bombardment resumed. Fresh artillery and tank fire targeted every suspected strongpoint ahead of the advancing infantry. American units pushed farther east, reducing bunker after bunker. For the defenders, the second day was often worse than the first. Food and water were running out. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted. Many wounded had been left untreated for more than 24 hours. The tropical heat inside enclosed shelters became suffocating. Bodies could not be buried. The smell of smoke, blood, and decomposing flesh spread through the ruins. Some soldiers still believed reinforcements might come. Others understood that no help was possible. The nearest Japanese forces were too far away and under heavy attack themselves. American naval and air superiority made outside intervention impossible. Colonel Akiyama remained determined. Like many Japanese commanders of the period, he viewed surrender as unacceptable. The mission was to inflict maximum casualties and hold as long as possible. But by midday on February 2, organized resistance had largely fragmented. American troops encountered isolated but deadly strongpoints. A hidden machine gun could still pin down a platoon. A sniper concealed in rubble might delay an advance for an hour. A bunker with determined defenders could require tanks, engineers, and repeated assaults to eliminate. Yet each position was alone. By evening, U.S. forces had overrun most of the island. Surviving Japanese soldiers were compressed into smaller and smaller areas. Ammunition dwindled. Officers gathered remnants of shattered units for one final effort. During the night of February 2-3, many defenders prepared for what they knew would be their last attack. Some wrote final notes. Some shared water with wounded comrades. Others fixed bayonets and waited in silence. The bombardment had stripped away any illusion that the island could be held. Only death remained certain. Before dawn on February 3rd, large groups launched banzai attacks against American positions. The charges were sudden and violent. Men rushed through darkness shouting, firing rifles and throwing grenades. Some reached foxholes and fought hand to hand, but concentrated American machine gun and artillery fire tore through the attackers. When daylight returned, hundreds of bodies lay across the coral. Colonel Akiyama was killed during the final phase of the battle. With his death, effective command ended. On February 3rd, American troops declared Kwajalein Island secured, though mopping up operations continued as isolated holdouts were discovered and eliminated. The scale of destruction was staggering. What had once been a military base with barracks, roads, workshops, and defensive networks was now a landscape of craters and shattered palm stumps. Vehicles were burned-out shells. Bunkers were collapsed heaps of coral and timber. The island looked less like land than the remains of an enormous industrial demolition. The casualty figures revealed the battle's brutal imbalance. Approximately 7,870 Japanese personnel were killed during the operation on Kwajalein and nearby areas. Only a small number were captured alive, many of them wounded laborers or personnel, unable to continue fighting. On Kwajalein Island itself, organized resistance was almost entirely annihilated. American losses, though serious, were far lower than expected for an assault on a fortified position. The success demonstrated how effective coordinated bombardment, improved amphibious tactics, and close cooperation between infantry, tanks, engineers, artillery, and naval forces had become. For American planners, Kwajalein was a turning point. Earlier battles, such as Battle of Tarawa, had shown how costly frontal assaults could be. At Kwajalein, the lessons of Tarawa were applied with precision. Extensive pre-invasion bombardment, seizure of nearby artillery positions, and careful planning reduced casualties and overwhelmed defenses much faster than many had believed possible. The strategic consequences were immense. With the Marshalls breached, the United States gained airfields and anchorages deep in the Central Pacific. The victory opened the way to future operations against Atoll, the Battle of Saipan, and eventually the Mariana Islands, placing American bombers within range of Japan itself. But statistics alone cannot explain what happened in those bunkers. Imagine the final hours underground. The concussion of shells has become routine. Your canteen is nearly empty. The wounded beside you are barely conscious. The radio no longer works. Outside, tank engines rumble closer. Someone at the entrance tightens his grip on a rifle coated with coral dust. Then there is a burst of flame, a blast, and the bunker fills with smoke. For thousands of Japanese soldiers, the war ended exactly like that. They were not all elite infantrymen. Many were young conscripts, naval personnel, labor troops, and support workers. Some had never expected to fight in a major battle. Yet once the invasion began, they were trapped on a narrow island under overwhelming firepower, with no realistic chance of escape. The American soldiers who crossed the beaches faced their own dangers. Hidden machine guns, snipers, and nighttime attacks could kill without warning. Engineers carrying explosives and flamethrowers worked at close range against determined defenders. Tank crews advanced through rubble where every crater might conceal a gun. Their methodical advance reflected the growing strength of the U.S. military in 1944. Industry, logistics, training, and battlefield experience had combined into a highly efficient assault system. Kwajalein showed what happened when that system was directed against an isolated garrison with no air cover, no naval support, and no hope of reinforcement. Photographs taken after the battle are difficult to forget. Rows of destroyed bunkers, burned equipment, endless craters, and bodies lying where the final charges had failed. The word massacre is often used to describe Kwajalein because of the extraordinary death toll and the speed with which the garrison was wiped out. In only 4 days, one of Japan's key Pacific outposts was reduced to ruins, and thousands of defenders were killed. Yet the battle was not random slaughter. It was the result of strategic decisions, technological advantages, and tactical lessons learned at tremendous cost elsewhere in the Pacific. It demonstrated that fixed island defenses, however determined, could be crushed when isolated and subjected to concentrated combined arms assault. For Japanese commanders throughout the Pacific, Kwajalein was a warning. Traditional shoreline defenses were increasingly vulnerable. Future battles would shift toward deeper, more layered positions designed to prolong resistance and inflict heavier casualties. For the Americans, the victory reinforced confidence in the Central Pacific offensive. The long road toward Japan was still filled with brutal battles, but Kwajalein proved that heavily fortified positions could be taken faster and with fewer losses than many had feared. When the guns finally fell silent, the lagoon returned to stillness. Waves washed against the coral shore. Smoke drifted over broken palm trunks. American troops moved cautiously through the wreckage, searching bunkers for survivors. In many shelters, they found only silence, dust, and the dead. 4 days earlier, the island had been crowded with defenders convinced they would make the enemy pay dearly for every yard. Now, almost all of them were gone. The bunkers that had seemed strong enough to resist an empire had become seal tombs. And in the center of the Pacific, on a thin strip of coral surrounded by quiet blue water, the battle for Kwajalein revealed a new reality of war. Courage alone was no longer enough. Determination alone was no longer enough. Against overwhelming firepower, perfect coordination, and relentless method, entire garrisons could disappear in less than a week. That is why the Battle of Kwajalein remains one of the most devastating episodes of the Pacific War. In 4 days, approximately 7,870 Japanese soldiers and personnel were killed. In 4 days, a fortress ceased to exist. And in 4 days, the road to Japan moved one giant step closer.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.